September 1st, 1983, Napier, New Zealand. 14-year-old Kirsa Jensen would walk out of her home around 2:45 p.m. to go for a ride on her horse to a local beach, something not uncommon to the teen. She had actually planned to go with her friend, who at the last minute canceled. But as time drifted later into the evening, Kirsa's parents began to worry, as she usually did not stay gone too long, and around 5:45 p.m., about 3 hours after she had left home, her parents decided enough was enough and they began to search for her, but not before calling the police to report she was missing. And it didn't take very long to find Kirsa's horse, which had been tied up near a bridge about 4 miles away from her home. But Kirsa, that was another story. There was not one sign of her. It was then that her family and police knew something was very wrong. Soon, a huge number of volunteers joined the police to help search for the teenager, but they didn't have much luck. They even turned to local rivers and other waterways, but nothing. 5 days later, a $5,000 reward, or almost $16,000 in today's money, was offered by a local newspaper for any information leading to the recovery of Kirsa. And although this didn't lead to the finding of her, some substantial tips did come in, because the most important piece of information to come out was someone who noticed a girl that resembled Kirsa, although he wasn't sure. But whoever it was, he did see her standing next to an old World War II gun emplacement at the mouth of a river. The girl was being held at arm's length by a white man about 5'9" tall and 45 to 50 years old. The same witness noted a white utility vehicle with brown sides parked nearby. And this did not end up being bad information, because right after that, another witness called in and stated that they had actually stopped at the gun emplacement to talk to Kirsa, who had a bloodied face. When he asked her what had happened, she claimed she had fell from her horse. Kirsa then told the Good Samaritan that someone had gone to get her parents and they should be here any time. This was followed by a third witness who told police around 4:30, just an hour and a half after Kirsa left, there was a white utility vehicle coming off the bridge. This time, the description of the man was quite different. He was said to be brown-haired and 20 to 30 years old. In the passenger seat was a girl, and the man had his arm around her shoulders and he was driving with one hand. Now, was this the same man that was thought to be 45 to 50 years old, seen at the gun emplacement? The description was quite different, but it probably was the same man. Police did believe that she had been there for sure, though. This was almost certainly confirmed when they found the horse's bridle and hoof prints near the gun emplacement, as well as a part of a rope that was believed to have tethered the horse before it broke free. But more importantly, there was blood. But it was a bit odd in the fact that it had been recovered in droplets, suggesting a minor injury, possibly from coughing or flicking blood from a hand, and that it had not came from a severe wound. Decades later, in August of 2024, blood that had been recovered near the gun emplacement was finally tested and confirmed to be that of Kirsa. Although the case did get off to a slow start, detectives would eventually find out who this man was, or at least who they thought it was, and that man's name was John Russell, a man who had already been convicted previously for sexual assault. And this wasn't just detectives taking the easy way out and pinning the crime on a previously convicted felon of a similar crime, because when police interviewed Russell, he straight up told them he was the man who had been seen with Kirsa next to the gun emplacement. He is who the witnesses seen, but he stopped short of a confession, and other than him being around the emplacement when she disappeared, police didn't have much. But Russell tried to help detectives. He claimed he had seen Kirsa with a bald middle-aged man near the beach. Police, however, were unconvinced, and they thoroughly searched Russell's home and truck, and they did come up with a little find: 2 hairs in his vehicle that were said to be a strong match for Kirsa. But it wasn't conclusive, and Russell suggested it came about via accidental hair transfer, and he admitted he had talked to her. And police had to concede that Russell was right. It could have just gotten there accidentally, but detectives would catch what they thought was another break when John Russell, in 1985, 2 years after Kirsa vanished, confessed to murdering her. So why is this a mystery? Well, see, that's where it gets interesting. Sometime after Russell confessed, he retracted his confession, citing his mental illness, which will come into play later, leaving police again back at step 1. The case would go cold, and would stay that way for another 7 years, when something would happen that brought the case back to the forefront. In 1992, John Russell would delete himself in Hastings, some 25 minutes away from Napier. Sorry folks, I got warned about using the other word. He did not leave a note, nor did anyone know why he decided to take his own life, but it was soon discovered that he had just left a psychiatric facility where he had been getting help for his mental health condition. In fact, his mental health had been deteriorating ever since Kirsa disappeared. He even went to visit her father at church and his home, and it's thought he may have tried to delete himself prior to this in a sketchy automobile accident. And while police initially wondered if maybe he did this because he felt guilt over Kirsa, or, more than likely, the pressure of getting caught was just getting to be too much, they eventually started to change this line of thinking. And by 2009, the lead cold case detective in charge of looking into Kirsa's disappearance stated there was now more evidence that suggested Russell was not involved versus evidence that he was involved. And basically, that's it. Other than another man who came forward to falsely confess in 1999, there have been no persons of interest, at least none publicly, and it's not even 100% confirmed that there was foul play. And I guess I should note here that Napier is a town that actually sits near the ocean, and because of that, some think the sea may actually have the answer. Now I don't know why this would have played out, or why some people speculate it, but there seems to be somewhat of a popular theory that Kirsa, after falling off her horse, if you believe that one witness, walked down to the ocean to sit and wait on her parents, and then accidentally fell in. Maybe she was even concussed from the fall and was dizzy. Taking that line of thinking, some wonder if she was confused after the fall and wandered into a cave or fell into a mine or something like that. But what if it was foul play? Well, police now believe that it most likely wasn't John Russell, although they haven't completely ruled him out. So that brings up one huge problem with this entire case. If it was not John Russell, what are the odds that another pervert just happened to be driving by and seen Kirsa? If you believe his account that he was there. To add to this, what are the odds she had just fell off her horse and was waiting to be picked up by her parents, who had not been contacted by anyone? And while this is going on, a convicted pervert that had already served time for such an offense, John Russell, was just standing there nearby watching this whole thing play out. There's also the strangeness of all those other witness sightings. Like, was that really her riding in the white utility vehicle? If so, I'm going to guess Russell's vehicle was not white, which probably helped police eventually move past him. But it still leaves the question, was that even her in the vehicle? And if so, did this stranger say he would take her back to her parents and she jumped in with him? And what about the witness who said he was keeping her at arm's length? Or the witness who said he had his arm around her shoulders as they drove off? Likewise, there were two very different suspect descriptions, one in his 20s with brown hair, and another much older man, around 50 and bald. This is one of those cases that just had too much going on to ever sort the truth out, but hopefully the families do get some closure eventually. September 19th, 1952, Grange, Queensland, Australia. 22-year-old Betty Shanks would go to a night lecture at a high school in Brisbane, some 10 minutes away. She had just recently graduated from the University of Queensland and had began work as a public servant for the Commonwealth's Department of the Interior, and the lecture ended sometime around 9 p.m. The lecturer, a Edward Milliken, would give her and two other students a ride over to the train stop, where she intended to board and ride back to Grange, where she could then make the short 1/2 mile walk back home where she still lived with her parents. However, although it should have been a very brisk walk home, she was late, and her father wondered where she was. Being a concerned parent, he stayed up and waited, but she never arrived, and her father did not take things lightly. He woke her mother up, and they notified the police at 1:30 a.m., and going somewhat against how we view police of the 50s, the response to the search for Betty was pretty quick, as they started looking all over for her, and it didn't take them long to find her either. Just 4 hours later, at 5:35 a.m., when a local resident, who was also a policeman, Alex Stewart, would stumble across her, and she was deceased. But this was far from a regular assault and murder. Betty had been beaten severely. Several of her teeth were found 10 to 20 feet away, while her face and legs had traces of a black boot polish where she had been kicked. And most mysteriously, there was an unusual dotted imprint on her forehead before finally meeting her demise via being strangled. The next thing Alex noticed was her bra straps had been broken and her underwear had been removed. He wouldn't know it now, but an autopsy would reveal that strangely, she had not been sexually violated, suggesting that the attacker was interrupted and fled. Regardless, Alex notified his fellow officers who arrived on the scene shortly and taped off the area and started doing a search. It didn't take them long to find 2 large bloody handprints that had been left on a neighbor's fence. From this and the blood splatter around the scene, detectives deduced that the attack had taken place in the backyard and that Betty was either thrown or pushed over the fence before she was attacked. And like we referenced so many times in these stories, investigators began working backwards, trying to retrace her steps, run down leads, figure out a timeline, and unlike some cases we cover where hardly no tips come in this one, there were quite a few clues and witnesses. For one, we knew where Betty was. She had attended a lecture, and we also knew she did make it to the tram stop, and other witnesses for sure seen her exiting the tram around 9:30, just a half a mile from her home. And because of the tips that came in, police would actually get a very small time frame that this could have occurred, because 7 different witnesses would tell detectives they heard screams in the area at 9:40 p.m. One of those residents was Alex Stewart, the off-duty police officer. According to him, after hearing her screams, he looked out the front window towards the street in front of his home, as well as looking over at the nearby schoolyard, but he didn't see anything unusual. And it's really just bad luck, because Alex could not see his neighbor's yard, and that's where the individual was attacking her, just several feet away. So of course, when the all points bulletin went out for officers to go out and search for Betty, and when word made it back to Alex, he didn't have very far to walk to see her, which is why she was located pretty quickly. But there was more. 17-year-old Marie Patton was on that same tram with Betty, and eerily enough, she got off before Betty and began walking home, which was along the same route that Betty lived on. So she was about 1 minute ahead of her on their walk, and in spite of that, she didn't hear or see anyone on her walk home. So if this attacker had lied in wait, he simply let Marie pass for some reason, and instead went for Betty. Likewise, the location of the attack was less than a 2-minute walk away from when she got off the tram and began walking. However, she was actually attacked 5 or 6 minutes after she departed the tram. So, where was she, and what happened in that time frame? Detectives were not sure, but they wondered if Betty may have stopped to talk to someone. This actually became an even bigger theory after one witness claimed to have seen 2 people walking along the same route at 9:36 p.m., but this person could not identify who they were. Likewise, a passenger from the tram that came right after walked by the backyard at 9:53 p.m., the time that it's believed Betty had died. Going by her watch was stopped at that time, and it's most likely the killer was still there. And again, it's just a bad break that this witness did not see him. 47 minutes after her watch stopped, a taxi driver picked up a man with blood on his face and clothes about 1 mile from the murder scene. Police, nor the taxi driver, were ever able to identify him. The motive seemed obvious, although police were not as sure. One thing was clear though, there was no robbery attempt, as Betty's jewelry and handbag were untouched. Although the contents had been spilled over in the area, police soon realized that whoever done this most likely had a history of violence, as this was a brutal assault. One key thing to remember was this was the 1950s, a long ways off from modern criminal forensics. Police basically had to use good old-fashioned detective work, and one of the early suspects that came up on the radar was the man in the brown suit. Apparently, before the attack, 4 different witnesses claimed a tall man with a brown suit was restlessly pacing around the tram terminus. He was described as being about 6 foot tall with a round face and a good head of hair. Some believe this man was named Eric Sturry, a married man and local blacksmith. Just a few months prior, he had been hired to change some locks on the Shanks' home. In spite of his marriage, he was very interested in Betty, but she was not interested in him. But just where did the police come up with this theory? Apparently, Eric Sturry's own daughter, Desh, told police on 2 separate occasions that her father, Eric, had become infatuated with Betty after changing the locks on her parents' home. And on the night of the murder, she seen him burning his clothes, and a pair of leather boots she claimed matched the imprint left on Betty's head. And eerily enough, Marie Patton, who had left the tram first and walked ahead of Betty, said this man walking around at the terminus did look like Eric Sturry. But maybe the biggest clue was when Eric Sturry died in 1997, and his family began looking through his belongings. They found a family photo album, and inside it was a picture of Betty he had kept 45 years. He had even written on the back, Betty Thomas Shanks, murdered 1952. Betty's supervisor would also report 2 days before she had been killed, she had received a mysterious and unsettling phone call from an unknown man that really shook her up. Now, was this the same man in the brown suit? That is unknown. Another early suspect was a local doctor named Doug Carter. See, this case became a nationwide story, and you can see why. But everyone in Australia had been following it through the newspapers, and just coincidentally, this well-known doctor apparently deleted himself just a few days after her murder. This was all the press and public needed to begin speculating that he was the killer. However, decades later, using DNA evidence that was found on Betty, ruled Carter out as a suspect. But what if we go back and discuss that dotted imprint found on her head? See, investigators soon realized the same evening of the murder, the Army had a number of officers at the nearby exhibition grounds, practicing for an event, one where marching bands, bagpipe players, etc. all come out for a parade type event. And these Army officers wore canvas gaiters, ones where the bottoms were not unlike the unusual dotted imprint left on Betty. But when investigators pursued this theory, it also led nowhere, and police were back at square one until they received a tip to look at their own. Soon, a rumor swirled that a police officer riding a motorcycle through the area deliberately hit Betty and drove away, only to worry that she may have not died, so he returned to the scene and strangled her and fled the scene. Apparently the motive was this man had made advances on Betty only for her to turn him down because he was married. Then, according to this theory, the police helped to cover up the story. I could never find this officer's name, but the main thing going for it was her injuries, which investigators believed matched the handlebars of the motorcycle, and some of the markings on her forehead were said to match protective gear worn by cyclists, as well as the fact that a few witnesses reported hearing a motorcycle around the time of the screams. Other theories involved a violent sexual predator and Betty was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or that Betty was attacked in the mistaken belief that she was a doctor's receptionist named Enna Hamilton, who looked a lot like Betty and walked the same route at the same time every night. Except for this night, she had actually taken an earlier tram, and just why she was targeted is interesting and makes a lot of sense. Enna carried keys to the doctor's office where surgeries were performed, which means the man was probably looking for drugs. But when this assailant attacked Betty and could not find those keys, he, in his drug withdrawal mental state, started beating her, trying to get her to tell him where the keys were. Over the decades, numerous people have confessed to her murder, with one coming as late as 2022, and all of these have been investigated and ruled out. 1848, at the Korotangi River in Queensland, Australia, 34-year-old explorer Ludwig Leichhardt was gearing up for his upcoming expedition to the Swan River, nearly 3,000 miles away. The journey would see him cross the far west of Australia all the way to the east coast, and considering it was 1848, it was obviously not without risk. However, Ludwig was an experienced and famous explorer. He had actually only appeared in Sydney some 6 years prior, hoping to explore the central part of Australia, and then hopefully acquire a government position. After 2 years of doing his studying of the local flora and fauna, he heard about an upcoming expedition to explore the northern part of the country. He eagerly went to sign up, only to find out that the expedition had fell through. So Ludwig finally gave up on waiting for a government-funded expedition and decided to go himself, which he supported by private funding and with the help of volunteers, and he left in October of 1844, making a 3,000-mile overland journey which took over a year, and in the meantime, everyone just assumed the whole party had died. Now Ludwig was a hero, and the colonial government was interested in funding his next expedition. However, this one would not be the success he had hoped for, and after going 500 miles, the party turned back due to heavy rain, malaria, and famine. Plus, his party was threatening to mutiny and kill him because he had not brought a medical kit. This caused Ludwig to suffer a nervous breakdown, and the Aboriginal guide would lead the crew back home. But Ludwig would not be deterred. After recovering from malaria, he would spend 6 weeks planning his next expedition, the one that starts this mystery. So he would set out with 4 Europeans, 2 Aboriginal guides, 7 horses, 20 mules, and 50 bulls. The Europeans were Adolf Classen, Arthur Hentig, Donald Stewart, and Thomas Hands, who was a former convict, while the Aboriginal guides were Wamai and Billy Bombat. The journey was risky and ambitious, maybe too ambitious, but Ludwig had pulled off a similar journey before. The party set out in March of 1848 and would arrive a month later to a now sparsely populated town called Mukadia. It's here that Ludwig would be seen moving inland to unknown terrain. The expedition was set to take between 2 and 3 years, so no one was alarmed when he did not show up for a year, and considering he had survived previously going unheard from for a period of years, it made sense. However, Ludwig and everyone from the party was never seen again, and it's went down as one of the oldest Australian mysteries that has been investigated by numerous people from his time period all the way up to right now. But it was around the 4-year point after the party had disembarked that everyone pretty much assumed he and everyone else in his crew had died. But how and where, they had no idea, as the last time he had been spotted was in Mukadia. But colonial authorities wanted to know, because it was quite possible Ludwig had recorded a lot of information from this land unknown to practically everyone else. So expeditions were mounted by the government of New South Wales, one by another explorer, Hoveden Haley, who had traveled with Ludwig on the second expedition. And it's this search, in April of 1858, 10 years after Ludwig had disappeared, that the first sign of the party was found. Near a river, near a town now known as Blackall. The crew found 2 trees here that had been marked with the letter L. Obviously, everyone pretty much assumed it had stood for Ludwig. This tree was found about 255 miles away from where Ludwig and his team were last seen. They also found 3 tomahawks that had been made from saddle gullet plates, which the local indigenous people told them belonged to Ludwig. These same indigenous people would tell him that there had been a massacre after they had followed Ludwig's party for days and surprise attacked them at dawn. The horses and mules were then killed and eaten, and the cattle escaped. It apparently happened because Ludwig's party had mistreated some of the local indigenous women. And that made sense because a similar incident happened on Ludwig's first expedition. However, these indigenous people refused to take Hoveden to the massacre site. A further search by Hoveden would find nothing, and it would stay that way for 6 more years, when in 1864, explorer Duncan McIntyre would find 2 more trees that had been marked with the letter L, this time much further away, up in the northern part of the country near the Gulf of Carpentaria, some 1,200 miles away from where they had left, which cast doubt on the story that they had been massacred earlier. Interestingly, McIntyre noted that the carving looked to be about 15 years old. I don't know how he determined that, but the dating would check out with Ludwig's movements, and it shows that he was at least alive for a year into the expedition. McIntyre did continue to search the area, but found nothing else of interest. The mystery would drag on for another 5 years when the government of Western Australia began to hear rumors of an isolated place that had remains of horses and men that had been killed by indigenous Australians, and again, an expedition was launched and nothing was found. By this point, the search for Ludwig's fate lost steam, and it would be over 30 years later when explorer David Carnegie, in 1896, would encounter some Aborigines who were carrying an iron tent peg, the lid of a tin matchbox, and part of the ironwork of a saddle. Carnegie would later report these findings which he speculated came from Ludwig's expedition. It would be 4 years later in 1900 that we would get the last physical piece of evidence from the expedition, that of a small brass plate that had Ludwig's name on it. By 2006, historians and scientists alike could 100% verify that it came from the expedition, and judging by where it was found, near Sturk Creek, between the Tanami and Great Sandy Deserts, it appeared Ludwig and his crew had made it at least 2/3 of the way through the journey. The plate also had another strange and interesting clue. It was attached to a partially burnt rifle butt, which had been slung up in a tree. Now, as mentioned, this was the last piece of real hard, tangible evidence, but there was at least one odd thing that came up in 1975. A ranger named Zach Matthias came into the Northern Territory with some interesting photos. These, he alleged, were Aboriginal cave paintings showing white men and an animal, and quite possibly indicated some conclusion to Ludwig's expedition. Now, what's crazy about this is after showing the photo around, people, of course, wanted to go to this cave and look at these drawings as they could be very important. However, Zach Matthias disappeared and was never seen again. However, he was rediscovered in the mid-1990s by the Aboriginal people, who then made it available to the greater Australian public in 2009. Regardless, we now go to theories, and one of the earliest, and maybe most likely, is the party were all killed by indigenous peoples. In fact, as late as 2003, a librarian at NSW State Library found a letter that may actually have the answer to the mystery. It was dated April 2nd, 1874, close to 30 years after the ill-fated expedition, and this letter had been received by a man of the clergy in Sydney named William Brown White Clark, and it had been sent by a man named W.P. Gordon. Now, Gordon was a station owner who had actually met Ludwig early in the expedition, about 80 miles into it, and just a few days before Ludwig was last seen leaving Muckadia. Now, this letter from Gordon explained that he had moved to Wallumbilla and had lived there for more than 10 years, and in that time, he had befriended the Wambabila tribe, and they began to share stories about their folklore and past, and it was soon that they told him about a white man who had led a party of mules and bulls along the Maranoa River many years ago. According to this man, the Aboriginals had encircled the party and murdered everyone. If that is true, then the reason the belongings from the party have popped up all over the place was because the Aboriginals took their goods and traded them, which ended up causing the items to appear massive distances apart, and it would also mean that Ludwig only made it about 180 miles into the expedition before dying. However, that doesn't explain the marked trees thousands of miles away from this site where they were allegedly massacred, so many do not believe this theory, or at least they don't believe it happened this early in the expedition. Others think it could have been something simple as drowning on a river crossing, or just succumbing to the elements. It's likely going by the trails that were marked that they made it to the desert where they then just couldn't deal with the harsh environment and died from starvation, thirst, or exhaustion. It's also possible they died from malaria, which Ludwig had already gotten once prior on the second expedition. And mentioning that expedition, it's possible, just like then, that there was a mutiny and Ludwig was killed. Or maybe the two parties split up, with one group going back to find civilization, while the others pushed forward and both parties died. 1878, near Aotea Harbour, in Waikato, New Zealand, a man named Mr. Albert Walker would come to town holding an artifact that seemed to be rather old and out of place. It was the carving into a serpentine stone of some kind of bird, one that seemed like a mix between a whale bird, a duck, and a pigeon or dove. The stone weighed about 5 pounds and was around 10 inches long. According to Albert, the artifact had been found by a local Maori, hidden under the roots of a tree that had just been blown over in a storm, and he had given it to Albert. Now here he was, trying to sell this old piece in town, which he did to an antique and ethnographic dealer, a Major Drummond Hay. It's here, in Major Drummond's home, that an old chieftainess, upon seeing it, immediately bowed and began to sing a lament to the Korotangi. This caused the news to spread amongst the Maori, and soon they began to claim it was a sacred talisman that had apparently been lost in a war. They stated the artifact was from Hawaii, which, in Polynesian folklore, was the original home of all the Polynesians before they colonized all the islands of the Pacific. This, Hawaii, is a mystery unto itself, with many believing it is the island of Raiatea, while even crazier theories suggest South America. But that's not really our mystery, because we pretty much know it's not from there, or anywhere in Polynesia, and that's because this artifact was made with metal tools, which the Polynesians did not have. Likewise, there is no carving ever been found in Oceania that even looks similar to this, and at least one source I found dated the carving back to 790 AD, but I must stress, I could only find one source for that. But if it's true, then we can safely rule out Europeans. So how the heck did this thing get here? Well, one big part of this mystery goes back to the story of it coming from Hawaii. See, the Maori claimed it came aboard one of their canoes, which could suggest that it indeed came from one of these islands that they just identified as Hawaii. Or it could suggest long-distance trade. But with whom? Which brings us to the next interesting point. Of the Maori chiefs that come to visit the item, a Te Ngākau claimed that the bird was not a Maori bird and that it came from a great distance, a foreign land, or over the sea. One of these locations that has been theorized is Indonesia, China, or Japan, which is definitely possible, but how it got there is still a mystery. If we take the part that it came over in a canoe as the truth, then you would think that it had to be trade, but that brings up other issues, like there should have been no trade going on between the Polynesians and pretty much anyone else. Likewise, if there was trade, say with Indonesia, China, or Japan, how come there wasn't more trade that followed up between them? We know China sent exploration and trading ships south, but there's no real proof they ever made it to New Zealand or even Australia. But it is possible the Korotangi made it from one of these countries through a vast and complicated trade network that had minimal contact with the Polynesians, although again, we have no proof for that either. The next thought is that the artifact was lost on an island, or maybe it was tossed out by some of these traders, and then the Polynesians, who were always exploring these areas, came across it. There's also the thought that the earliest European explorers, after learning about Polynesian culture, crafted the bird themselves to use in trade. The only problem with this theory is that one source that dates the artifact back to the 8th century. But again, I can only find one source that claimed that. But if it's true, that rules out the Europeans. And of course, the biggest part of this mystery, and one of the biggest theories, is pre-columbian contact. That's right, some believe that this suggests that Europeans, or maybe the Chinese, or some other people altogether, were visiting New Zealand way before we ever thought possible. And that brings us to the end of the first installment of Mysteries from Down Under. I hope you guys liked it. Goodbye and good night.